Hey there. Welcome to the Stillness Broadcast. I'm here to help you relax tonight with stories that linger in the quiet spaces between sleep and waking. Before you settle in too deeply, take just a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy what we do here. And here's something I'm really curious about. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. It's amazing to think of all of us scattered across the world, connected by these dark tales. Now get comfortable, dim those lights. Maybe let the shadows gather in the corners of your room. And let's begin our journey together. Story 1. The apartment had been empty for 6 months before Michael Chen moved in. The landlord mentioned this during the viewing, his voice carrying that particular tone of forced casualness that people use when they're trying not to lie but aren't quite telling the truth either. Previous tenant left rather suddenly, Mr. Kowalski had said, jangling his keys as they stood in the narrow hallway. Nothing wrong with the place, just one of those things. Michael hadn't asked what kind of things. The rent was $700 below market rate for Capitol Hill, and his graduate student stipend wasn't designed for Seattle's housing costs. The apartment had hardwood floors, tall windows that faced west, and a clawfoot bathtub that looked like it belonged in a museum. He signed the lease that afternoon. The first week passed normally enough. Michael unpacked his books and arranged his desk to face the window, where he could watch the late summer light turn the buildings golden in the evenings. His roommate from undergrad helped him assemble furniture from IKEA, and they ordered pizza and drank beer on the living room floor because Michael hadn't bought a couch yet. Everything felt like the beginning of something good, the kind of fresh start that graduate school was supposed to represent. He noticed the smell on the 8th day. It arrived sometime between leaving for his morning seminar and returning home at 3 in the afternoon. Not a dramatic smell, not the obvious stench of rot or decay that would send you running for the phone to call maintenance. This was subtler, a sweetness that seemed wrong somehow, like flowers left too long in water, or fruit that had passed from ripe to something else entirely. Michael checked the garbage disposal, examined the seals on the refrigerator, and opened all the windows to air out the space. The smell faded by evening but returned the next afternoon, stronger this time, concentrated near the bathroom. He mentioned it to his neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Park, who had lived in the building for 30 years. She was watering plants on her balcony when he caught her, and something in her expression changed when he described the smell. "Which apartment did you say?" she asked, though he knew she'd seen him coming and going from 4B for over a week. 4B, just down the hall from you." Mrs. Park's watering can paused mid-pour, creating a small puddle on her balcony that she didn't seem to notice. "I would talk to Mr. Kowalski about that. Tell him it's coming back." Coming back. The phrase lodged in Michael's mind like a splinter, but Mrs. Park had already retreated inside, her door clicking shut with a finality that didn't invite follow-up questions. The smell intensified over the following days, developing new characteristics that Michael found himself cataloging with the obsessive attention he usually reserved for his research. By day 12, he detected notes of copper beneath the sweetness. By day 15, something that reminded him of wet earth. By day 18, he started to wonder if the smell was actually there at all, or if he'd simply thought about it so much that his brain had begun manufacturing the sensation. He called Mr. Kowalski, who arrived on a Saturday morning with a toolkit and the weary expression of a man who'd made this trip before. The landlord checked the pipes, examined the ventilation, and spent nearly 20 minutes in the bathroom running water and peering into the drain with a flashlight. "Don't see anything wrong," he announced, emerging from the bathroom with damp knees and a face carefully arranged into neutrality. Sometimes these old buildings, they hold on to smells. Previous tenant, she was very particular about scents. Burned a lot of candles, incense, that sort of thing. Maybe what you're smelling is residue. But the previous tenant hadn't burned candles. Michael knew this because he'd found her mail still being delivered to his apartment. Magazines, credit card offers, a subscription renewal notice for something called the Botanist's Quarterly. Her name was Sarah Brennan, and according to the dates on the magazines, she'd lived there for 3 years before her sudden departure. Michael had been collecting her mail in a drawer, meaning to give it to Mr. Kowalski, but he kept forgetting. Now he pulled out the stack and noticed something he'd missed before. Every piece of mail was dated from 6 months ago or earlier. Nothing recent, nothing from the period when the apartment supposedly sat empty. That night, Michael dreamed of flowers. Not the pleasant dreams of botanical gardens or spring meadows, but something else entirely. He stood in his bathroom, watching flowers grow from the grout between the tiles. They sprouted with impossible speed, their stems thick and white like bone, their petals a deep purple that was almost black. The smell from his waking hours filled the dream bathroom, so strong it made him gag. He tried to leave, but the door had grown shut, sealed over with the same white stems that now covered the walls, the ceiling, the mirror. In the dream, he understood that the flowers were feeding on something beneath the floor, something that had been there for 6 months, or waiting patiently to bloom. He woke at 4 in the morning, mouth dry, heart racing. The smell was overwhelming. Not subtle anymore, not something he could half convince himself was imagination. It filled his bedroom like a physical presence, sweet and copper and wrong. Michael stumbled to the window and threw it open, gasping at the cool night air. Below, the street was empty except for a single car parked beneath a streetlight. In his disoriented state, he thought he saw someone sitting in the driver's seat, looking up at his window, but when he blinked and looked again, the car was empty. The next morning, he did what he probably should have done weeks ago. He searched for Sarah Brennan online. The results appeared immediately. Dozens of them, all from 6 months ago. "Local woman missing," read the first headline. "Capitol Hill resident vanishes without trace." Police request information on Sarah Brennan, 32. Michael clicked through the articles with cold fingers, learning the story in fragments. Sarah had been reported missing by her sister after failing to show up for their mother's birthday dinner. Her car was still in the building's parking garage. Her purse was in her apartment. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Security footage showed her entering the building on a Friday evening and never leaving. The police had investigated, interviewed neighbors, searched the apartment thoroughly. No signs of foul play, no indication of where she might have gone, just another person who had seemingly stepped out of her life and vanished. The articles included a photo. Sarah Brennan had dark curly hair and wore glasses with thick frames. She was smiling at the camera in that slightly awkward way people smile when someone tells them to say cheese. She looked completely ordinary, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second thought. Michael stared at her photo and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd been living in her apartment, sleeping in her bedroom, showering in her bathroom for 3 weeks. And now her apartment smelled like death. He called the police, the non-emergency line, because he wasn't sure this qualified as an emergency. A bored-sounding operator took his information and said someone would come by to take a statement. That was at 9 in the morning. By 3 in the afternoon, When no one had arrived, Michael called again. Different operator, same bored tone, same promise that someone would follow up. He gave up at 5 and decided to investigate himself. The smell was strongest in the bathroom, concentrated near the base of the toilet. Michael knelt on the tile floor, the same tiles he'd dreamed about, though these were thankfully flour-free, and examined the area where the toilet met the floor. The caulking looked old, yellowed in places, cracked in others. He pressed his finger against it and felt it give slightly, revealing a dark gap between porcelain and tile. The smell rushed out of that gap like something escaping, so strong it made his eyes water. He jerked back, gagging, and scrambled to his feet. For a moment, he stood in his bathroom doorway, breathing hard, trying to convince himself that what he'd just felt was imagination. But he could still smell it on his fingers, could still see that dark gap where the caulking had failed, could still feel the wrongness of it, the sense that something beneath his bathroom floor was very badly wrong. Michael spent that night at his roommate's place, sleeping on a couch that smelled like old beer and newer regrets. He didn't explain why he needed somewhere to stay, and his roommate didn't ask. Some friendships operated on the principle of strategic ignorance, and this was one of them. But lying in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of someone else's apartment, Michael couldn't stop thinking about that gap beneath the toilet, about Sarah Brennan entering her building on a Friday evening 6 months ago and never leaving, about the way Mr. Kowalski's face had carefully arranged itself into neutrality when discussing the smell. He returned to his apartment the next morning because he had nowhere else to go and a lease he couldn't afford to break. The smell had faded again, retreating to its usual subtle presence that he could almost ignore if he tried hard enough. Michael went about his day in a state of performative normalcy, made coffee, ate breakfast, sat at his desk and pretended to read journal articles while his eyes skimmed over words without comprehension. At noon, the doorbell rang. The police officer who stood in his hallway was younger than Michael expected, with red hair pulled back in a tight bun and an expression of professional sympathy that had probably been practiced in a mirror. "Mr. Chen, I'm Officer Reeves. You called yesterday about a smell in your apartment?" Michael let her in and explained everything he knew, which wasn't much. The smell, the timeline, Sarah Brennan's disappearance, the gap beneath the toilet. Officer Reeves listened with the focused attention of someone trained to detect lies, and Michael found himself volunteering details he hadn't planned to share. The dreams about flowers, the way the smell seemed to intensify in the afternoons, the feeling that something was very wrong with his bathroom. "And you've been living here for 3 weeks?" Officer Reeves asked, making notes in a small spiral pad. "Yes, since August 15th. And the previous tenant, Ms. Brennan, was reported missing in February." Officer Reeves flipped through her notes. "The apartment was processed as part of that investigation. Forensics team spent 2 days here. They didn't find anything unusual." "Then why does it smell like something died in here?" Michael's voice came out sharper than he intended. Officer Reeves looked at him with an expression that might have been pity, or might have been something else entirely. "Mr. Chen, I'm not saying your concerns aren't valid, but you should know that sometimes when people are aware of a traumatic event associated with a location, they can experience sensory phenomena that aren't necessarily based on physical evidence. It's a documented psychological response." She was calling him crazy in the gentlest way possible. Michael felt anger rise in his throat like bile. "Come smell it yourself," he said, leading her to the bathroom. Right there, by the toilet. Tell me I'm imagining that. Officer Reeves followed him and dutifully crouched next to the toilet, positioning herself near the gap he'd discovered. Michael watched her face carefully, looking for the reaction that would validate everything he'd been experiencing. But she simply sniffed, straightened, and shook her head. I don't smell anything unusual, just standard bathroom odor. Maybe a little mildew, but that's normal in these older buildings. Michael pushed past her and crouched in the same spot, pressing his nose near the gap. The smell hit him immediately, strong as ever. Sweet copper earth rot. Unmistakable. He looked up at Officer Reeves, who was watching him with that careful expression again. You really don't smell it? I really don't. Mr. Chen, have you been under a lot of stress lately? New city, graduate school, living alone. She was giving him an out, Michael realized. A way to reframe this entire interaction as the understandable anxiety of an overstressed student, rather than something that might require actual investigation. He could take it, could agree that yes, he'd been under stress. Yes, maybe his imagination was working overtime. Yes, he'd look into counseling resources at the university. The path of least resistance stretched before him, smooth and easy. But he couldn't take it. Couldn't pretend that the smell was in his head when he could literally smell it right now, strong enough to make his stomach churn. I'm not crazy, he said quietly. Something is wrong with this apartment. Officer Reeves studied him for a long moment, then sighed. I'll file a report and recommend a follow-up inspection. But Mr. Chen, I want to be honest with you. The Sarah Brennan case is still open, but it's cold. There's no evidence she came to harm in this apartment. People vanish sometimes. It's terrible, and it's traumatic for the families, but it happens. Whatever you're smelling, it's probably not connected to her disappearance. She left her card on his kitchen counter, told him to call if he experienced anything concrete, a phrase that hung in the air with implicit criticism, and departed with the same professional sympathy she'd arrived with. Michael stood in his apartment, surrounded by the smell that no one else could detect, and felt utterly alone. The dreams intensified. Every night the bathroom flowers grew more aggressive, their white bone stems cracking through tile and drywall, their purple-black petals opening to reveal throats that dripped with something viscous. Sometimes Sarah Brennan was there, standing in the bathtub, her face serene as the flowers grew from her hair. Her mouth, the hollow spaces where her eyes should be. She never spoke, but Michael felt her trying to communicate something urgent. A warning, maybe, or an accusation. He'd wake drenched in sweat, the smell so overwhelming that he'd run to the window and vomit into the alley below. His neighbors began to complain, not about the vomiting, which they apparently didn't notice, but about the sounds, the way he'd cry out in his sleep, the thudding of his body hitting the floor when he'd roll out of bed, tangled in sheets, desperate to escape the dream flowers that followed him into waking. Michael stopped attending classes. He'd sit in his apartment during the day, watching the afternoon light move across his floors, waiting for the smell to strengthen. It always did, like clockwork, around 3 p.m. He began to mark the time, timing it with compulsive precision. 2:57, faint sweetness. 3:03, copper notes emerging. 3:15, earth and rot, fully present. 3:30, overwhelming, unbearable, impossible to ignore. Then it would fade again as evening approached, retreating to something almost manageable. He documented everything in a notebook, filling pages with his observations, trying to find patterns that might lead to understanding. His advisor emailed, concerned about his absences, His roommate texted, asking if everything was okay. His mother called, and he let it go to voicemail because he couldn't imagine explaining any of this. How did you tell people that your apartment smelled like death? That you were dreaming of flowers growing from a missing woman's corpse? That you were slowly coming to understand that Sarah Brennan had never left this apartment? That she was still here, beneath the bathroom floor, feeding the smell that no one else could detect? On the 37th day of living in apartment 4B, Michael decided to tear up the bathroom floor. He waited until 3 a.m., when the building was quiet, and began prying up tiles with a flathead screwdriver and a hammer he'd bought from the hardware store down the street. The tiles came up easier than he expected, revealing black mold and water damage and rot that should have made the floor structurally unsound. He kept digging, kept tearing through layers of old tile and adhesive and wood that crumbled in his hands. The smell was overpowering, but also vindicating. This was real. This was physical. This was evidence. He'd excavated about 4 square feet when his screwdriver hit something that wasn't wood or tile, something that gave slightly beneath pressure, like plastic or rubber. Michael stopped, breathing hard, staring at what he'd uncovered. A black garbage bag, carefully sealed with duct tape, buried beneath 2 inches of subflooring that someone had meticulously reconstructed. His hands were shaking as he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. Not the non-emergency line this time, the real thing. "I found her," he said when the operator answered. "I found Sarah Brennan." The police arrived with more people than Michael expected. Officers and detectives and crime scene technicians and someone from the medical examiner's office. They evacuated the building, stringing yellow tape across his doorway, transforming his apartment into a crime scene. Michael sat in the hallway with Mrs. Park and the other residents, wrapped in a blanket someone had given him, watching the parade of professionals enter and exit his bathroom. No one would tell him anything. They just kept asking questions. When had he started smelling it? Why had he decided to tear up the floor? Had anyone told him to do that? Had he experienced any contact with the previous tenant before moving in? Mr. Kowalski arrived around 5 in the morning, gray-faced and stuttering. The police separated him from the residents and took him into an empty apartment for questioning. Through the thin walls, Michael could hear the landlord's voice rising and falling, words muffled but tone clear. Defensive, frightened. Guilt had a particular sound, Michael was learning, a particular frequency that carried through walls. Officer Reeves emerged from his apartment at dawn, pulling off latex gloves as she approached where he sat. She looked tired and vindicated and angry all at once. "We found her," she said simply. "Sarah Brennan. She'd been there the whole time, beneath the bathroom floor." Michael nodded, feeling strangely numb. He'd known, had known for days, really, but hearing it confirmed transformed suspicion into terrible fact. "How?" he asked. Officer Reeves sat down beside him on the floor, her back against the wall. Professional distance temporarily abandoned. "The preliminary assessment suggests blunt force trauma. She was killed in the apartment and concealed beneath the bathroom floor. Someone did a fairly sophisticated job of reconstruction, replaced the subflooring, retiled, caulked everything carefully. If you hadn't started smelling decomposition, she might have stayed there indefinitely." "Mr. Kowalski?" Michael asked, though he already knew the answer. "We're not releasing information about suspects yet, but let's just say your landlord has some explaining to do." Officer Reeves paused, choosing her words carefully. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Chen. When you called, when you said something was wrong with the apartment, I should have taken you more seriously. I'm sorry." Michael spent the next 3 days in a hotel paid for by the police department, giving statements and answering questions and trying to process what he'd discovered. The media picked up the story quickly, and his phone buzzed with calls from reporters and true crime podcasters and television producers who wanted exclusive interviews. He ignored them all. What was there to say? That he'd moved into an apartment where a woman had been murdered and buried. That he'd smelled her decomposition for 5 weeks while everyone told him it was in his head. That his bathroom had been her grave. The details emerged slowly. Mr. Kowalski confessed after 12 hours of questioning, his lawyer negotiating for terms that Michael found obscene. Sarah Brennan had complained about repairs that needed to be made in her apartment. She'd threatened to contact the housing authority, to file official complaints that might bring inspectors who'd discover all the code violations Mr. Kowalski had been ignoring for years. They'd argued on that Friday evening. He'd pushed her, he claimed. She'd hit her head on the edge of the bathtub. It was an accident, he insisted. The concealment was panic. The reconstruction was desperation. He'd used Sarah's keys to lock the apartment from the inside, then reported her missing a week later when her sister started asking questions. It was perfect except for the smell, except it wasn't an accident. The coroner's report, leaked to a journalist Michael vaguely knew from undergrad, told a different story. Multiple instances of blunt force trauma, defensive wounds on Sarah's hands and arms. This had been murder, planned or spontaneous, but definitely murder. And Mr. Kowalski had almost gotten away with it. Michael never returned to apartment 4B. The university helped him find new housing, and he spent the rest of September moving his belongings from a crime scene to a bland studio in the university district that smelled only of fresh paint and other people's cooking. He threw away anything that hadn't been in the bathroom. The bath mat, the shower curtain, his towels. Even though they'd never touched what was beneath the floor, he couldn't separate them from the knowledge of what they'd been hanging above. The dreams continued, but they changed. Now Sarah Brennan stood in rooms that were no longer his, her face peaceful, flowers no longer growing from her body. Sometimes she'd smile at him. Sometimes she'd simply nod, an acknowledgement of what he'd done. Once, memorably, she spoke. "Thank you," she said, her voice like wind through leaves. "Thank you for digging." Michael woke from that dream crying, though he couldn't have explained why. The trial happened months later, and Michael attended every day of it, sitting in the back row of the courtroom while lawyers argued about intent and opportunity and the precise sequence of events that had led to Sarah Brennan's body being sealed beneath a bathroom floor. Her sister sat 3 rows ahead of him, shoulders rigid with grief, surrounded by family members who looked exhausted by the long wait for something resembling justice. When the guilty verdict was read, Michael watched her shoulders finally relax, just slightly. It wasn't closure. He was learning that closure was a myth people told themselves. But it was something, an acknowledgement that what had happened was wrong, was criminal, was not going to be forgotten or dismissed. In the hallway afterward, Sarah's sister found him. Her name was Jennifer, and she had her sister's curly hair, but not her smile. "You're Michael Chen," she said. Not a question. "I wanted to thank you for not giving up, for trusting what you sensed, even when everyone told you it was nothing." Michael didn't know what to say. "You're welcome" seemed insufficient. "I'm sorry" seemed wrong. Instead, he told her the truth. "I think she wanted to be found. I think she was trying to tell me where to look." Jennifer studied his face. weighing whether he was serious or offering some kind of new age comfort that she didn't need. Then she nodded. Sarah was stubborn. She wouldn't have wanted him to get away with it. She hugged him then, briefly, and walked away to join her family. Michael stood in the courthouse hallway long after everyone else had left, thinking about flowers that grew from death, about smells that only some people could detect, about the strange ways the dead communicate with the living when they need someone to dig. He thought about Sarah Brennan entering her building on a Friday evening, probably thinking about what to make for dinner or whether she needed to do laundry, completely unaware that she had minutes left to live. The randomness of it felt unbearable. The waste. He went back to his studies eventually, finished his graduate program, wrote a dissertation on something completely unrelated to death or smells or hidden crimes, got a job, got married, got a dog who hated baths and loved running through the flower beds at the park near their house, built a life that looked, from the outside, completely normal. But he never forgot the smell. Never forgot the feeling of crouching on his bathroom floor at 3 a.m, screwdriver in hand, digging through layers of carefully reconstructed flooring to find proof that his senses were telling him something true. And whenever he passed a clawfoot bathtub in an antique store or a renovation show, he'd think of Sarah Brennan and feel grateful that he'd listened to his instincts even when everyone told him he was wrong. The flowers from his dreams never returned, but sometimes in early spring, when the gardens around Seattle bloomed with impossible color and overwhelming scent, Michael would catch a whiff of something beneath the beauty, something that smelled like copper and earth and the patient waiting of things buried. He'd pause just for a moment and remember that the ground beneath our feet holds more stories than we want to believe. And sometimes, if we're paying attention, those stories ask to be told. Story 2. The inheritance wasn't supposed to be complicated. Eleanor Price, 76 and sharp as broken glass, had lived her entire adult life in the same colonial house on Maple Drive in Westfield, Massachusetts. She'd outlived 2 husbands, raised 3 children, and accumulated enough antique furniture to stock a decent museum. When she died peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday in October, her will specified exactly how her estate should be divided among her children, with surgical precision that suggested years of careful consideration. The house itself went to her oldest daughter, Patricia, which surprised no one. Patricia had always been Eleanor's favorite, though everyone pretended this wasn't true. Patricia arrived from Boston 3 days after the funeral, prepared to spend a weekend sorting through her mother's possessions before putting the house on the market. She'd taken Friday off work, planning to drive back Sunday evening with whatever items she'd decided to keep. The rest would be donated or sold at a state auction. She'd done this before when her first husband's mother passed, and she approached the task with efficient detachment. Grief was something you schedule around, not something you let derail your plans. The house looked exactly as Eleanor had left it. Museum clean, obsessively organized, every surface dusted, and every book arranged alphabetically. Patricia walked through rooms that smelled like lavender and furniture polish, mentally cataloging what might be valuable enough to keep. The grandfather clock in the hallway. Possibly. The Persian rug in the dining room. Definitely. The collection of Depression glass in the china cabinet. She'd have to research current market values. It wasn't that she was mercenary exactly, just practical. The house was worth nearly $800,000, and estate taxes would consume a substantial portion of that. anything she could recoup through selective sales would help offset the financial burden. She started in the master bedroom, which her mother had maintained with the precision of a woman who believed that domestic order reflected moral character. The bed was made with hospital corners. The closet contained clothes arranged by color and season. The dresser drawers held undergarments folded into perfect squares. Patricia worked through it methodically, separating items into boxes marked keep, donate, and trash. Most of Eleanor's clothes were dated enough to qualify for the donation pile, though a few designer pieces went into keep. Patricia had friends who collected vintage fashion. It was while emptying the third dresser drawer that she found the photograph. Not hidden exactly, but placed beneath a stack of wool scarves in a way that suggested it wasn't meant to be easily discovered. The photo was old, maybe from the 1970s, judging by the color saturation and the clothes. It showed a young woman, early 20s probably, standing in front of what looked like the house Patricia was currently sorting. The woman wore bell-bottom jeans and a peasant blouse. Her long hair parted in the middle and falling past her shoulders. She was smiling at the camera, squinting slightly in bright sunlight. Patricia didn't recognize her. She flipped the photo over. On the back, in her mother's precise handwriting, Diana, summer 1974. Diana. Patricia turned the name over in her mind, searching for family connections. She had an aunt named Diana, but she died years ago, and the woman in this photo looked nothing like the Aunt Patricia remembered from childhood Thanksgivings. She set the photo aside and continued working, but the unknown face nagged at her. Her mother had been meticulous about family documentation. Every relative, no matter how distant, had been logged in Eleanor's leather-bound address book, with birth dates and relationships carefully noted. Who was Diana, and why had she been important enough to photograph, but not important enough to mention? Patricia spent Friday evening going through her mother's office, a converted sun porch at the back of the house where Eleanor had managed household accounts and correspondence. The desk drawers revealed the expected items, bills paid and filed chronologically, tax returns organized by year, the insurance documents in labeled folders. But beneath the hanging files, Patricia found a box. Cardboard, about the size of a shoebox, unmarked. Inside were more photographs, dozens of them, all of Diana. Diana at the beach, Diana in the kitchen, Diana reading in the backyard hammock, Diana wearing Eleanor's gardening hat and laughing at something off camera, Diana sitting on the porch steps with someone whose arm was visible in the frame but whose face had been carefully cut out of the photograph. Patricia spread the pictures across the desk and felt something cold settle in her stomach. These weren't casual snapshots. These were the photographs of someone documenting a relationship, someone preserving memories of time spent together, someone who cared. She called her brother Marcus, who picked up on the fifth ring. "Have you ever heard Mom mention someone named Diana?" Patricia asked without preamble. "Diana, like Aunt Diana?" "No, not Aunt Diana. Someone else. Young woman, 1970s. There are photos of her all over Mom's desk." Silence on the other end. Then, "Mom never mentioned anyone named Diana. Not that I remember. Why?" Patricia described what she'd found, the photograph in the drawer, the box full of images, the careful preservation of someone's memory. Marcus listened with what sounded like only partial attention. He'd never been particularly interested in family history. Maybe she was a friend. Mom had friends before she had us, you know. "These aren't friend photos, Marcus. These are..." Patricia struggled for the right word. "These are intimate." Oh, another pause. You think Mom was gay? I don't know what to think. But whoever Diana was, she mattered to Mom. A lot. After hanging up, Patricia continued searching. She found Diana's presence scattered throughout the house like archaeological evidence. A book of poetry inscribed to E with love always, D on the flyleaf. A concert program from a 1974 performance of The Marriage of Figaro, Eleanor and Diana written across the top. A pressed flower, a daisy appropriate, tucked into a copy of Ruby Fruit Jungle that Eleanor had definitely never mentioned owning. Each discovery felt like uncovering a hidden room in a house Patricia thought she knew completely. Her mother had been Eleanor Price, practical, proper, conventional to the point of rigidity. The kind of woman who joined the garden club and voted Republican, and attended Methodist services every Sunday without fail. Not the kind of woman who'd kept a box of photographs hidden in her desk, chronicling a relationship she'd never mentioned to her children. Patricia spent Saturday morning on ancestry websites, searching for any Diana connected to her mother. She found 3 possibilities: 2 distant cousins and 1 woman who'd lived on the same street in the 1970s. But none of the details matched. The cousins were too old or too young. The neighbor had moved to California in 1972 and died there in 1985. Dead ends, all of them. She was preparing to give up when she found the letters. They were in the attic, stored in a leather suitcase that also contained Eleanor's wedding dress and several baby blankets from Patricia and her siblings' infancy. 3 dozen letters tied with a faded ribbon addressed to Eleanor at the Maple Drive house in handwriting that slanted left and used elaborate loops on the capital letters. The return address was a post office box in Northampton. The name was Diana Castellano. Patricia sat on the attic floor surrounded by dust motes and filtered afternoon light, reading her mother's hidden history. The letters spanned 4 years, from 1974 to 1978, and they told a story Patricia had never imagined. Diana and Eleanor had met at a women's consciousness-raising group in Northampton. They'd become friends, then more than friends. Diana had stayed at the house that summer of 1974, officially as a boarder but actually as Eleanor's lover. They'd been careful. This was Massachusetts in the 70s, and discretion wasn't optional. But they'd built a life together in the spaces where discretion allowed. Dinners and concerts and lazy Sunday mornings. Plans for the future that involved moving to California, where women like them could live more openly. A future that sounded full of possibility and hope. Then the letters stopped. The last one, dated November 1978, was different from the others. Shorter. The handwriting looked rushed, as if written in anger or haste. E, I don't understand your decision, and I can't pretend I'm not devastated. You say you need to be practical, to think about your future, to consider what people will say. But what about us? What about the future we planned? I won't beg you to change your mind, but I need you to know that this isn't what I want. This will never be what I want. I love you. That hasn't changed and won't change. But I can't watch you marry someone else. I can't be your secret anymore. Goodbye, D. Patricia sat with that letter for a long time, reading and rereading, trying to understand. November 1978. She did the math. Her oldest brother had been born in October 1979. Her mother had married Patricia's father, her first husband Thomas, in March of 1979. 4 months after Diana's final letter, Patricia had grown up hearing the story of her parents' romance, how they'd met at a church social, how Thomas had courted Eleanor with old-fashioned formality, how they'd married after a brief engagement, because when you found the right person, why wait? She'd never questioned that narrative. Never wondered if her mother had chosen Thomas not out of love, but out of fear. Out of a desperate need to be normal, to be acceptable, to avoid the social cost of being a woman who loved women in a world that didn't tolerate such things. She thought about her mother's life as she'd known it. 2 marriages. Thomas had died of a heart attack when Patricia was 12, and Eleanor had remarried 5 years later to a man named Robert who'd been pleasant but forgettable. 3 children raised with stern discipline and high expectations, a household run with military precision, church every Sunday, garden club on Tuesdays, book club on Thursdays, a life of absolute respectability. And nowhere in that life had there been room for Diana Castellano or the relationship Eleanor had abandoned to achieve her vision of a proper life. Patricia called Marcus again. I found letters from Diana. Mom was in love with her. They were together in the 70s, and Mom ended it when she decided to marry Dad. Jesus, Marcus said, and Patricia could hear genuine shock in his voice. Did Dad know? I have no idea. The letters don't mention him. Diana just talks about Mom's decision to be practical. Do you think she regretted it? Mom, I mean. Do you think she spent her whole life regretting that she chose Dad instead of Diana? Patricia thought about her mother's face in her later years. The lines around her mouth that suggested she'd spent decades pressing her lips together against words she wouldn't allow herself to speak. Yeah, she said quietly. I think she probably did. The discovery changed how Patricia moved through the house. She saw it differently now, not as a museum of her mother's achieved respectability, but as a kind of mausoleum, a place where Eleanor had buried the person she'd wanted to be, sealing away that self as completely as if she'd built a wall over it. Every perfectly arranged room felt like evidence of work her mother had done to maintain the performance. Every alphabetized book and polished surface was proof of Eleanor's commitment to the life she'd chosen over the life she'd wanted. Patricia decided to find Diana. It felt important, necessary, though she couldn't have articulated why. She started with the obvious. Social media, search engines, public records. Diana Castellano was not an uncommon name, and Patricia found dozens of possibilities. But only one was the right age and had connections to Northampton. This Diana lived in Portland, Oregon. She'd never married. She'd worked as a librarian for 35 years before retiring. She had a profile on Facebook that was sparsely populated, but included a photo that showed an older version of the woman from Eleanor's hidden photographs. Same eyes, same smile, though sadder now, edged with the knowledge of time passing and choices that couldn't be unmade. Patricia spent 2 days debating whether to make contact. What would she even say? Hi, I'm the daughter of the woman who broke your heart 50 years ago. I found your letters in an attic and thought you might want to know that my mother kept them all this time. Even though she never mentioned you, it felt invasive, cruel even, like opening old wounds that had finally scarred over. But the alternative felt worse, leaving Diana in ignorance, never telling her that she'd been remembered, that the box of photographs and letters proved Eleanor hadn't forgotten, hadn't simply moved on without looking back. In the end, Patricia wrote a message on Facebook. She kept it simple, factual, stripped of the emotional complexity that churned beneath every sentence. Dear Ms. Castellano, my name is Patricia Price. I'm Eleanor Price's daughter. My mother passed away 2 weeks ago, and while sorting through her belongings, I found letters and photographs that suggest you and she were close in the 1970s. I wanted to let you know that she kept these items carefully preserved for over 40 years. If you're interested in having them, I'd be happy to send them to you. She pressed send before she could second-guess herself. Diana's response came within an hour. Patricia, thank you for reaching out. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your mother was an extraordinary person, and I'm sure her death has been difficult for you and your family. I would very much like to have the letters and photographs. They represent a time in my life that was transformative, even though it ended painfully. If you're willing, I'd also like to talk with you about your mother. There are things I think you should know about her, things she probably never told you. Would you be willing to meet? I can fly to Massachusetts if that would be easier for you. Best, Diana. They met on a Thursday afternoon at a coffee shop in Northampton, halfway between Patricia's hotel and the address Diana had given. Diana arrived first, and Patricia recognized her immediately from her Facebook photo, though the reality of her was different from the digital image. Older, obviously, but also more present, more substantial. She wore jeans and a sweater and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd long ago made peace with who she was. Patricia? Diana stood as she approached, and they shook hands awkwardly. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Thank you for being willing to talk, Patricia said, and they sat across from each other at a small table by the window, coffee cooling between them while they figured out how to begin. Diana spoke first. Your mother was the love of my life, she said simply. I know that probably sounds dramatic, especially given that we were together for only 4 years, and I've lived another 50 years since then. But it's true. I've had other relationships, some of them quite good, but none of them were Eleanor. She was brilliant and funny and deeply kind when she let herself be. She was also terrified of judgment, of poverty, of ending up alone. And ultimately, that fear was stronger than our love. Patricia listened, trying to reconcile this description with the mother she'd known, stern, emotionally distant, more comfortable with rules than with affection. She never seemed afraid of anything, Patricia heard herself say. She was afraid of everything, Diana countered gently. That's why she was so rigid. She built herself a fortress of respectability because she thought it would keep her safe. They talked for 3 hours. Diana told stories about Eleanor that Patricia had never heard. Eleanor drunk on wine at a concert, laughing so hard she couldn't breathe. Eleanor reading poetry aloud in bed. Eleanor making elaborate plans for their future in California, where they'd get jobs at a college or a library and live in a house with a garden and 2 cats. Eleanor, who had been young and in love and full of hope before she'd decided that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. She sent me 1 letter after we ended, Diana said. About 6 months after she married your father. She said she was pregnant and that she hoped I was happy for her. She said she'd made the right choice, that she could already tell she was going to have a good life. But I could read between the lines. She was trying to convince herself as much as me. Patricia thought about her childhood, about the distance she'd always felt between herself and her mother, the sense that Eleanor was performing motherhood rather than feeling it, the way she'd corrected more than she'd comforted, instructed more than she'd embraced. Do you think she loved us? Patricia asked. Me and my brothers. Do you think she loved us? Or were we just part of the performance? Diana reached across the table and took Patricia's hand. I think she loved you as much as she was capable of loving anything after she'd cut out the part of herself that knew how to be vulnerable. That's not your fault. That's the tragedy of what she did. She didn't just lose me. She lost herself. Before leaving, Patricia gave Diana the box of letters and photographs. Diana held it carefully, like something precious and fragile and irreplaceable. "I'm glad you found these," Diana said. "I'm glad Eleanor kept them. It means that part of her life wasn't a complete lie, that she remembered at least." "She never stopped missing you," Patricia said, though she didn't know if this was true. "I think that's why she couldn't mention you to us, because talking about you would have meant acknowledging everything she'd given up." Diana smiled sadly. "That's generous of you to think so. I'm not sure Eleanor would have framed it that way, but I appreciate you saying it." They hugged before parting, and Patricia felt something shift in her understanding of inheritance. What her mother had left her wasn't just a house and furniture and bank accounts. It was also this story, this hidden history of love and fear and choices that shaped lives in ways that rippled forward for decades. Patricia had spent her life believing she knew her mother, understanding Eleanor through the framework Eleanor had provided. Dutiful wife, responsible mother, respectable widow. But that framework had been a construction carefully built to conceal the architecture underneath. The real Eleanor had been buried so deep that her own children had never caught a glimpse of her. Patricia returned to the house on Maple Drive that evening and walked through it with new eyes. She saw the performance now, could read it in every perfectly arranged room. The guest bedroom that was always clean but never used. How many times had Eleanor stood in that doorway, remembering Diana sleeping there that summer in 1974. The garden her mother had maintained with obsessive care. Had she chosen those flowers because Diana had liked them? The bookshelf in the study, alphabetically arranged. How many times had Eleanor's hand paused on the spine of Ruby Fruit Jungle, remembering when she'd allowed herself to be the person who read such books openly? She called her siblings and told them everything. Marcus was quiet, processing. Her youngest brother, David, asked questions that Patricia couldn't answer about what this meant for their understanding of their family. "Does it change anything?" David asked finally. "Does knowing Mom was gay and gave up a relationship to marry Dad change who we are?" Patricia thought about that. "No," she said slowly. "But it changes how I understand Mom. And maybe that changes how I understand the choices I've made in my own life, the ways I've compromised to be acceptable." That evening, Patricia made a decision. She wasn't going to sell the house, not yet. Instead, she was going to do something her mother had never gotten to do. She was going to make it honest. She spent the weekend sorting through Eleanor's possessions with new purpose, keeping the things that told the truth of her mother's life. The photograph of Diana that had been hidden in a dresser drawer now sat on the mantel. The book of poetry now lived on the coffee table. The pressed daisy now hung in a frame in the hallway. She created a space where Eleanor's hidden self could finally be visible, even if Eleanor herself was gone. When Patricia finally locked the door of the house on Maple Drive 3 months later, preparing to return to Boston, she stood on the porch for a long moment, looking at the place where her mother had built her life sentence by careful sentence. The inheritance wasn't supposed to be complicated, she thought. But the most valuable things Eleanor had left her weren't the furniture or the bank accounts. They were the questions. The wondering about roads not taken and selves not claimed. The recognition that every life contained multitudes, and sometimes those multitudes were hidden even from the people who thought they knew us best. Patricia drove away with a car full of her mother's possessions and a mind full of stories she would spend years learning to tell. Stories about a woman named Diana, and another woman named Eleanor, and a summer in 1974 when the future seemed full of possibility before fear taught them both That possibility was dangerous. And somewhere in Portland, Diana Castellano opened a box of old letters and photographs and allowed herself to cry for the woman she'd loved and lost, the life they'd almost built together, the choices that had seemed so impossible then and so inevitable now, looking back across half a century of lived experience. The inheritance both women understood was grief, but also memory. And that was worth something, even now, especially now. Story 3. The church youth group voted unanimously to visit the Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Louisville, Kentucky, for their annual October mission trip. This surprised Pastor Mitchell, who'd assumed the teenagers would choose something more obviously charitable, building houses in Appalachia or running a soup kitchen in Cincinnati. But 17-year-old Liam Martinez had made a compelling presentation about the importance of confronting fear and bearing witness to suffering, even historical suffering. The sanatorium had housed tuberculosis patients in the early 20th century, and thousands had died there before antibiotics rendered the building obsolete. Now it operated as a tourist attraction, offering historical tours and overnight ghost hunts for people interested in the paranormal. We could document the history, Liam had argued. Interview former patients if any are still alive. Create an oral history project about medical care before modern medicine. It's educational and spiritual, understanding how people face death with faith during the TB epidemic. Pastor Mitchell, who was 34 and still remembered being 17 and finding elaborate justifications for things he wanted to do, recognized a persuasive hustle when he heard one. The kids wanted to go to a haunted building, but Liam had wrapped that desire in language about witness and history and faith, and the church board had approved the trip based on his presentation. So here they were. 15 teenagers and 3 adult chaperones arrived at Waverly Hills on a Friday evening in mid-October. The building rose against the darkening sky like something from a Gothic novel, massive, decaying, its hundreds of windows reflecting sunset in ways that made the structure look like it was breathing. The tour guide, a woman named Sheila who wore a Waverly Hills staff shirt and had the weary enthusiasm of someone who'd given this speech 1,000 times, gathered them in the entrance hall. "Welcome to Waverly Hills Sanatorium," she began. From 1910 to 1961, this building housed patients suffering from tuberculosis, which was then called the White Plague. At its peak, Waverly treated over 400 patients at once. Many of them died here. We estimate between 8,000 and 63,000 deaths over the building's operational period, though records are incomplete. She led them through corridors that still smelled faintly of antiseptic and decay, explaining the history of TB treatment. The rest cure that kept patients lying still for months. The heliotherapy that exposed infected lungs to sunlight and fresh air. The surgical interventions that collapsed lungs or removed ribs to give diseased tissue room to heal. All of it sounded medieval to the teenagers, who'd grown up in a world where tuberculosis was something that happened in other countries, to other people. They saw the operating theater where experimental surgeries had been performed. The children's ward where juvenile patients had been separated from their parents for months or years. The roof deck where patients had slept in the open air, even in winter, because fresh air was believed to speed recovery. And finally, the body chute, a tunnel that had allowed staff to remove corpses without demoralizing living patients by making them watch the constant parade of death. The body chute is off limits during tours, Sheila explained. Structural instability, but you can see the entrance there. They'd load bodies onto a rail cart and send them down to the bottom of the hill, where hearses waited. Some weeks, they removed dozens of bodies. One particularly bad outbreak in 1924 killed more than 100 patients in 2 months. The teenagers took photos and giggled nervously and asked questions about ghosts that Sheila answered with practiced ambiguity. Yes, people reported unusual experiences at Waverly. No, she couldn't confirm anything definitively paranormal. Yes, she'd had some encounters she couldn't explain. No, she wouldn't elaborate while they were still inside the building because she didn't want to influence their experiences. The overnight ghost hunt began at 11 p.m. Sheila divided them into groups of 5 and assigned each group a floor to investigate. Pastor Mitchell's group included Liam, plus 3 other teenagers, Sophie, Marcus, and a quiet girl named Bethany, who'd spent most of the drive reading poetry and hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to anyone. They were assigned the 4th floor, which had housed the worst cases, the patients who weren't expected to recover. This floor has the most reported activity, Sheila told them cheerfully, handing Pastor Mitchell a walkie-talkie. Room 502 especially, if you experience anything unusual, which you probably won't, but if you do, just radio down. I'll be in the main office. Don't leave your assigned floor. Don't enter any rooms marked unsafe, and don't do anything stupid. She smiled in a way that suggested she'd seen plenty of people do stupid things and was resigned to seeing more. Pastor Mitchell led his group to the 4th floor and tried to project calm adult confidence while privately wondering if this whole trip had been a terrible idea. The floor was darker than he'd expected, with only emergency lighting providing dim illumination at widely spaced intervals. The windows showed nothing but darkness and the distant lights of Louisville. The silence was absolute. No traffic noise, no building sounds, just the occasional drip of water from failing pipes. "So what do we do?" Sophie asked. "Just walk around looking for ghosts?" "We're not looking for ghosts," Pastor Mitchell corrected. "We're experiencing the space and reflecting on the suffering that occurred here, bearing witness to history." Liam grinned. "Right. So we're looking for ghosts, but calling it bearing witness." "Sure, Liam. We're looking for ghosts." They split into pairs. Pastor Mitchell with Liam, Sophie with Bethany, Marcus filming everything on his phone for what he described as documentation. But what everyone understood was social media content. They agreed to meet back at the central stairwell in an hour. Pastor Mitchell and Liam started with room 502, the one Sheila had specifically mentioned. It looked like every other room on the floor, empty except for a rusting bed frame, water-stained walls, and the accumulated debris of decades of abandonment. Graffiti covered available surfaces with the usual collection of declarations and obscenities. Someone had spray-painted "She's Still Here" across one wall in letters 2 feet high. "Who's still here?" Liam asked, running his phone's flashlight across the message. "The ghost, supposedly. A nurse who worked at Waverly committed suicide in this room, hung herself in the bathroom. People say they've seen her." Pastor Mitchell moved to the window and looked out at the darkness. "That's probably apocryphal. Every haunted building has a story about someone who killed themselves. It's part of the standard mythology." "You don't believe in ghosts, Pastor?" "I believe in grief. I believe suffering leaves marks on places. Whether those marks are literal spirits or just psychological weight, I don't know. But I believe this place absorbed a lot of pain, and people who are sensitive to that might experience it in ways that feel supernatural." Liam considered this. "That's a very diplomatic answer that doesn't actually tell me if you believe in ghosts." It's a very pastoral answer that acknowledges multiple possible truths. Without committing to any single interpretation, they explored the room for another 10 minutes, finding nothing unusual except the pervasive sadness that seemed built into the walls themselves. Pastor Mitchell was preparing to suggest they move on, when Liam stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" Pastor Mitchell listened. Faintly, from somewhere down the hall, came a sound. Not quite singing, not quite crying, something between the two. "One of the other groups," Pastor Mitchell said, though he didn't quite believe it. The sound had a quality that didn't seem human. Or if it was human in distress, producing sound out of pain rather than communication. They moved into the hallway and followed the sound to its source. A room about halfway down the corridor. The door was closed but not latched. Pastor Mitchell pushed it open slowly, phone flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was identical to 502. Same bed frame, same water damage, same graffiti. But the sound was louder here. Definitely coming from this space. Not from the walls or the floor, but from the air itself, as though the room were producing the sound, rather than transmitting it from somewhere else. "Hello?" Pastor Mitchell called. "Is someone here? Sophie? Marcus?" The sound stopped. In the sudden silence, Pastor Mitchell became aware of his own heartbeat, rapid and loud. Beside him, Liam had gone very still, phone held at an odd angle, face pale in the dim light. "Pastor, look at your phone." Pastor Mitchell looked down. His phone screen showed the usual flashlight interface, but superimposed over it was something else. Text appearing as he watched, letter by letter, as though someone were typing, "Help me." "Is that an app?" Pastor Mitchell's voice sounded strained to his own ears. "Is this some kind of joke you kids set up?" "I didn't set up anything." Liam held his own phone out. Same thing. Text appearing, letter by letter. "I can't leave. It won't let me." They backed out of the room quickly, both of them moving on instinct rather than conscious decision. The door swung shut behind them with a click that seemed too loud, too final. They stood in the hallway, breathing hard, phones clutched like weapons. "That was," Liam began, then stopped, apparently unable to find words adequate to what they'd just experienced. "That was something," Pastor Mitchell finished. "Something we should probably tell the others about." They found Sophie and Bethany in the central stairwell, sitting on the steps and talking quietly. Marcus was filming the hallway, panning his phone slowly across empty doorways. "Did you guys experience anything weird?" Pastor Mitchell asked, trying to sound casual and failing completely. Sophie exchanged a glance with Bethany. "Define weird." Text appearing on your phone screen, sounds that don't have an obvious source, general atmosphere of dread. "Oh good," Sophie said. "So we're not crazy." "Yes, we experienced weird things." Bethany's phone started playing music even though she didn't open any apps. Old music, like from the 40s or something, and we heard someone calling our names from one of the rooms. But when we checked, it was empty. Marcus lowered his phone. "I got something on video. At least I think I did. I need better light to check, but it looks like there's a figure in the background of one of my shots, standing at the end of the hallway. But I know the hallway was empty when I filmed it." Pastor Mitchell's pastoral training had not included a section on how to respond when multiple witnesses reported paranormal activity during what was supposed to be a character-building exercise. He made a decision. "We're going back to the office, all of us, now." They'd made it halfway down the stairwell when the lights went out. Not just the emergency lighting on their floor, but all the lights in the building, Complete darkness, so absolute that Pastor Mitchell couldn't see his hand when he held it in front of his face. 5 phones clicked on simultaneously, creating a small sphere of light that illuminated nothing useful. "Power outage," Sophie said, voice too loud in the darkness. "That's normal in old buildings, right?" "Probably," Pastor Mitchell agreed, with more confidence than he felt. He raised his walkie-talkie. "Sheila, we've lost power up here. Is this normal?" Static. Then, "Power's fine down here. All the first and second floor lights are operational. Can you make it down, or should I come up?" "We can make it down." They descended carefully, phones lighting the stairs ahead of them. Pastor Mitchell counted steps, trying to gauge their progress. First floor should be now. But when they reached what should have been the first floor landing, they found themselves still in the stairwell, still descending. "Pastor," Liam said quietly, "we should have reached the bottom by now." "I know. And these stairs." Marcus panned his phone down. The stairs continued as far as the light reached, spiraling down into darkness. Far more stairs than a 5-story building should contain. "We're going back up," Pastor Mitchell said. "Right now." They turned and started climbing. Pastor Mitchell counted again. Should have reached the 4th floor by now. Should have reached the 5th floor. Should have reached something other than more stairs. But the stairwell continued. Identical landing after identical landing, none of them opening onto the floors they'd just left. "Okay," Sophie's voice was carefully controlled. "Okay, I don't like this. I don't like this at all." "Everyone stay calm," Pastor Mitchell said, though his own calm was fracturing. "There's a rational explanation." "Name it," Marcus challenged. "Name one rational explanation for infinite stairs in a 5-story building." Pastor Mitchell couldn't. They climbed for what felt like an hour but was probably 10 minutes. Phone batteries draining, legs aching, growing increasingly desperate. Bethany started crying. Sophie joined her. Liam kept trying doors that they passed, dozens of them, all locked, all opening onto darkness instead of the floors they should have revealed. "This isn't possible," Marcus kept saying. "This violates physics. This isn't possible." Pastor Mitchell was about to suggest they stop and pray, which felt absurd but was the only option he could think of, when he heard it. The sound from earlier. Not quite singing, not quite crying, coming from below them, from the depths of the impossible stairwell. "Faster," he said. "Everyone move faster." They climbed. The sound followed, grew closer, resolved into something more distinct. Not one voice, but many. Dozens, hundreds, all making the same not quite human sound. The sound people make when they've given up hope but haven't yet died. "Pastor?" Sophie's voice broke. "What is that?" "I don't know. Keep climbing." Bethany stopped suddenly. "Look." They looked where she was pointing. One of the doors in the stairwell stood open. Not wide open, just slightly ajar, the way doors settle when they're not quite latched. Yellow light spilled from the gap. Warm light. Electric light. The kind of light that suggested normal spaces beyond, not infinite stairwells and approaching voices. "Should we?" Liam asked. Pastor Mitchell thought about the sounds below them, climbing closer. Thought about their draining phone batteries and growing exhaustion. Thought about the fact that they'd been trapped in this stairwell for long enough that other groups would have noticed their absence, would have radioed Sheila, would have started a search, unless time worked differently here. Unless the 10 minutes he thought had passed was actually seconds or hours or days. Yes, he decided. They went through the door. The corridor beyond looked like the 4th floor. But not quite. The same layout, same spacing of doors and windows, but everything somehow more present, less decayed. The walls weren't water-stained, the floors weren't littered with debris, and everywhere, in every window, every doorway, every corner, stood people. Patients, Pastor Mitchell realized. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, filling the corridor in impossible density. Men and women in hospital gowns, faces gaunt with illness, eyes hollow with suffering. None of them moved. They just stood, watching the 5 living humans with expressions of such desperate longing that Pastor Mitchell felt it like a physical weight. "Are we dead?" Sophie whispered. "Did we die on those stairs and not realize it?" "We're not dead," Pastor Mitchell said, though he wasn't certain. The patients parted as they moved forward, creating a narrow path through their massed bodies. Up close, Pastor Mitchell could see details he wished he couldn't. The blood on their gowns, the lesions on their skin, the way some of them seemed less solid than others, as though partially erased. They passed room after room, each one full of patients. In 502, a nurse stood motionless, a rope around her neck, face purple, eyes bulging. She watched them pass with an expression of profound exhaustion. At the end of the corridor, the stairwell door stood open. Pastor Mitchell could see normal stairs beyond it. Stairs that went down a reasonable distance to a visible landing. The way out. "Why are they letting us leave?" Marcus asked. "Because we're not dead," Bethany said quietly. It was the first thing she'd said since they'd entered this version of the 4th floor. They can only keep the dead. We're not dead yet. They reached the stairwell and descended. This time the stairs ended where they should. 1st floor, office. Sheila looking up from her desk with expression of mild surprise. "You guys okay? It's only been 20 minutes. Decided to quit early?" 20 minutes? Pastor Mitchell repeated. "It's been 20 minutes? Since you went up to the 4th floor?" "Yeah." Sheila checked her watch. 23 minutes now. Why? "Can you check on the other groups?" Pastor Mitchell's voice sounded strange to his own ears. Flat, shocked. "Make sure they're all okay." Sheila raised an eyebrow but picked up her radio. A few minutes of back and forth confirmed that all 3 other groups were fine, investigating their assigned floors, experiencing nothing unusual except the general creepiness of a dark, abandoned building. No infinite stairs, no crowds of dead patients, no messages appearing on phone screens. "What did you guys see up there?" Sheila asked, and something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Or if not the specific answer, at least the general category of experience they'd had. "We saw," Pastor Mitchell paused, choosing words carefully. "We saw something we don't have language for. Something that can't be real but was." Sheila nodded slowly. "Happens sometimes. Not to everyone. Not even to most people. But sometimes Waverly shows visitors something true. Something it once witnessed." "What does that mean?" Liam demanded. "Once witnessed." The suffering here was enormous. Thousands of people died, often alone, often in pain that we can't imagine now that we have effective pain management and antibiotics. All that suffering, it doesn't just vanish. It saturates places, becomes part of the architecture, and sometimes, rarely, the place needs someone to acknowledge it, to see it, to confirm it happened. "So we were chosen." Sophie's voice carried an edge of hysteria. "For what? To be traumatized, to have nightmares for the rest of our lives about dead people in hallways. To witness," Sheila said simply. "To remember. To tell the story so that what happened here doesn't get forgotten or reduced to ghost stories that people tell at sleepovers. You saw the truth of this place." That's worth something. They left Waverly Hills at 2 in the morning. Pastor Mitchell filed a report with the church board that carefully edited what had occurred, framing it as an educational experience about historical medical care and the importance of bearing witness to suffering. He did not mention infinite stairs or crowds of dead patients or the way room 502 had made him feel like he was drowning in someone else's despair. The teenagers were less circumspect. Marcus posted his video online, and it went modestly viral among people interested in the paranormal. Sophie wrote an essay about the experience for her college applications, framing it as a moment of spiritual awakening. Bethany wrote poetry that she never shared with anyone, but that filled 3 notebooks with images of hollow-eyed patients and descending stairs. Liam, who'd been so eager to visit Waverly Hills, never talked about that night at all. But Pastor Mitchell noticed that he started carrying a small flashlight on his keychain, and that he avoided dark stairwells, and that sometimes when he thought no one was watching, his expression would go distant and sad, as though remembering something he wished he could forget. A year later, Pastor Mitchell got a letter from Sheila at Waverly Hills. It contained a newspaper clipping from 1924, a list of patients who died during the outbreak that year. Circled in red pen was a name: Elizabeth Marsh, age 17, died October 14, 1924. "Thought you'd want to know," Sheila had written at the bottom of the page. "The girl who kept crying in the hallway. We found her name in the records. She was real. They all were." Pastor Mitchell kept the clipping in his desk drawer, pulled it out sometimes when he needed to remember that witness matters, that seeing painful truth serves a purpose, even when, especially when, those truths are uncomfortable. The teenagers eventually graduated and moved on to college and careers and lives that took them far from that October night in Louisville. But none of them ever forgot the 4th floor of Waverly Hills, the infinite stairs, the crowds of suffering dead, the way a building could hold on to pain so tightly that it became visible to those willing to look. And sometimes, on particularly dark nights, each of them would lie awake and wonder if they'd actually escaped that stairwell at all, or if they were still descending, still searching for a way out that didn't exist, still trapped in a moment that had expanded to hold them forever, still witnessing, still remembering, still carrying the weight of all that suffering, which was, Sheila had promised, worth something. Though what it was worth, and to whom remained questions none of them could answer. Story 4. The nursing home smelled the way they all did. Bleach and old food, and something beneath those surface smells that Margaret Chen had learned not to examine too closely. She signed in at the front desk, exchanged pleasantries with the receptionist, who recognized her from weekly visits, and made her way down the antiseptic corridor to room 247. Her grandmother was awake today, which was good. The past few weeks had been difficult, the Alzheimer's progressing in ways that turned her grandmother into someone unfamiliar. But today, when Margaret entered, Grace Chen looked up from her chair by the window and smiled. "Margaret, you came." "Of course I came, Grandma. I come every Sunday." Margaret settled into the visitor's chair and began the small talk that had become ritual. How was the food? Fine. Had she made it to the crafts group? Yes, and she'd made a painted flower pot that now sat on her windowsill. Did she need anything from the outside world? No, she had everything she needed. Then, as Margaret was preparing to leave after her usual hour, her grandmother said something unexpected. "I need to tell you about the babies." Margaret paused, hand on her purse. "The babies? The ones I saved. Before you ask me about them, before I forget again." Grace's eyes had gone distant, focused on something beyond the window. I need to tell someone before it's too late, before the disease takes it all away. Grandma, I don't know what you mean. Sit down, please. This is important. Something in her grandmother's voice, clarity that had been absent for months, made Margaret sit. In 1972, Grace began. I worked as a night nurse at St. Joseph's Hospital in San Francisco, the maternity ward. It was a good job, steady, and I was young enough that working nights didn't bother me. I'd take the bus to work at sunset and back home at sunrise, sleeping during the day in my apartment in the Tenderloin. Normal life. Unremarkable. Until I started noticing the discrepancies. Grace's hands twisted in her lap, working at a memory that still caused distress after 5 decades. The hospital kept meticulous records, every birth logged, every infant accounted for. But occasionally, not often, maybe once every few months, the numbers wouldn't match. A woman would deliver twins, but the charts would show only one infant. Or a stillbirth would be recorded, but I'd remember that baby crying. Little things, easy to attribute to exhaustion or misremembering. I'd told myself that for months. Margaret leaned forward. What was actually happening? The babies were being sold. Grace said it simply, flatly, as though stating an obvious fact. Not all of them, just the ones from mothers who wouldn't make a fuss. Unmarried women, teenagers, immigrants with poor English, the vulnerable ones. Dr. Morrison ran it. He'd arrange for the adoptions, tell the mothers their babies had died or were too sick to survive, and complete the paperwork to make it all look legitimate. Then he'd hand the infants to people who'd paid him. People desperate for children who couldn't adopt through normal channels. Grandma, that's... Margaret struggled for words. That's kidnapping, human trafficking. Yes, it took me 3 months to piece it together, and another 2 months to decide what to do about it. Going to the police seemed impossible. Dr. Morrison had connections throughout the city, and I was just a nurse. Who would believe me over a respected physician? But I couldn't keep working there, couldn't keep seeing these women grieve children that were alive, somewhere else being raised by strangers who'd paid for them like property. Grace stood and walked to her dresser, moving with more purpose than Margaret had seen in months. She opened the bottom drawer and removed a small wooden box, bringing it back to her chair with careful hands. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. I started stealing the babies, Grace said. Not all of them. I couldn't save them all. But when I knew Dr. Morrison had targeted a child, when I saw the signs, the particular way he'd handle the delivery, the way he'd send certain nurses away during critical moments, I'd find a way to intervene. Switch the infant with one who'd actually died. Claim there was an emergency in another room. Whatever it took to get that baby away from him. Margaret stared at the photographs. They showed infants, some only hours old, others a few days or weeks. Each photo had a date written on the back and a brief note. Baby girl, delivered May 12th, 1972. Mother age 16, placed with family in Oakland. Baby boy, delivered August 3rd, 1972. Mother recent immigrant, placed with church family in Sacramento. Where did you place them? Margaret's voice came out as a whisper. With people I trusted. Other nurses who wanted children, church families. My own relatives, 2 of your second cousins, were babies I saved. I'd tell the mothers their children had died, which sounds monstrous, I know. But the alternative was letting Dr. Morrison sell them to whoever could pay. At least my way, the babies went to families who wanted them for the right reasons. Families I'd vetted. Families who'd love them. This is, Margaret began, then stopped, unable to process what she was hearing. Her grandmother had stolen babies, had systematically lied to mothers and falsified records and distributed infants to her personal network like contraband. "This is insane, Grandma. You kidnapped children." "I saved children," Grace corrected firmly. "I saved them from being sold. Yes, I made the mothers believe their babies had died, and that haunts me. Every one of those women's faces haunts me. But I couldn't tell them the truth. Couldn't say, 'Your baby is alive, and I'm taking them to keep them safe.' Because they might have tried to keep the child themselves, which would have alerted Dr. Morrison. He would have found a way to take that baby anyway, and he would have made sure I couldn't interfere again, possibly permanently." Margaret thought about what her grandmother was implying. "He would have killed you?" "I was a Chinese immigrant nurse going against a white doctor with political connections in 1970s San Francisco. Yes, Margaret, he would have found a way to neutralize me if he'd known what I was doing. So I was careful, so careful. For 3 years I stole babies 1 or 2 at a time, placing them where I thought they'd be safe, keeping meticulous records because I couldn't forget them. Couldn't forget what I'd done." "What happened? Why did you stop?" "Dr. Morrison got caught. Not for the baby selling. He was never charged with that, but he got caught prescribing medications illegally, writing prescriptions for people who'd pay him under the table. Lost his license in 1975. After that, the baby trafficking stopped, and I could finally quit that job. Move on with my life, or try to." Margaret looked at the photographs again, counting them. 23 babies stolen over 3 years. "Did any of them ever find out? The people you placed them with? Did you tell them where the babies came from?" "Some of them knew, the ones I trusted completely. I told them I'd saved these children from a bad situation. I didn't give details. Others, I let them believe the adoptions were legitimate. Told them I knew a lawyer who could arrange paperwork. They were so grateful to have children that they didn't ask too many questions." This revelation sat heavy in Margaret's chest. Her family tree apparently included people who weren't actually related to her. People who'd been stolen as infants and integrated into the Chen family network through her grandmother's covert operation. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I'm forgetting. The Alzheimer's is taking pieces of me every day, and soon I won't remember any of this. Won't remember their faces or their names or what I did. And before that happens, I need someone to know. Someone to bear witness. I need you to know that I'm not just your grandmother who worked as a nurse and retired quietly. I need you to know what I did. The choices I made. Whether they were right or wrong." "I don't know if they were right or wrong," Margaret admitted. "I understand why you did it. But Grandma, those mothers, they grieved children who were alive. That's monstrous." "Yes, I know." Grace's voice dropped to barely audible. "I dream about them sometimes. The mothers. I see their faces when I told them their babies hadn't survived. The way they'd break. The sounds they'd make. I carry that. I've carried it for 50 years. But I'd do it again. Because the alternative was worse." Margaret wanted to argue that point. Wanted to insist there must have been another way. But she couldn't think of one. What could a single nurse have done against a well-connected doctor in 1970s San Francisco? Going to authorities might have ended the trafficking, but it also might have accomplished nothing except getting Grace fired or worse. "What do you want me to do with this information?" Margaret asked finally. "Nothing. Or something. I don't know." Grace looked down at the photographs spread across her lap. "I just needed someone to know. needed the truth to exist outside my own head before my head can't hold it anymore. You're a journalist. You understand the importance of documentation, of making sure stories don't get lost. Margaret was indeed a journalist, though she covered tech startups, not historical crimes. But her grandmother was right about one thing. Margaret understood the power of documentation, of making sure truths were recorded even when they were uncomfortable, especially when they were uncomfortable. "I'll keep these," Margaret said, gathering the photographs carefully. "I'll preserve your story. I don't know if I'll publish it. That would require more investigation, confirmation, finding some of these people if they're still alive. But I'll make sure it doesn't get lost." Grace's shoulders relaxed slightly, some burden partially lifted. "Thank you. That's all I wanted. Someone to know. Someone to remember when I can't anymore." Margaret visited every Sunday for the next 8 months, and each visit her grandmother remembered less. The sharp clarity of that conversation about the babies faded into confusion, then into absence. By April, Grace didn't recognize Margaret at all, called her by other names, asked where her husband was. Margaret's grandfather had been dead for 15 years. The disease took everything eventually, leaving behind a woman who looked like Grace Chen, but wasn't. Not really. Not anymore. Grace died on a Tuesday in June, peacefully, in her sleep. Margaret arranged the funeral and sorted through her grandmother's belongings and found the wooden box of photographs, exactly where she'd left it in the dresser drawer. She spent the next year investigating. It was harder than she'd anticipated. Records from the 1970s were incomplete. Many of the people involved were dead, and the hospital had changed ownership twice since then. But Margaret was good at her job, and she approached the story with journalistic rigor. She found 3 of the stolen babies, now middle-aged adults with lives and families of their own. All 3 had been told they were adopted, though the circumstances varied. One had always known she was found through a nurse who'd helped place her. Another had discovered the truth only when genetic testing for health reasons revealed no biological connection to her supposed birth family. The third had never known and was devastated to learn his entire life was built on lies and stolen identity. Margaret found 2 of the mothers. One had died years ago, but her daughter, the sister of one of the stolen babies, agreed to speak on record. She described her mother's lifelong grief, the way she'd commemorated the death of her firstborn every year with visits to a cemetery plot that held nothing but a memorial stone. Learning that her brother was alive, was living in Sacramento with a family who'd raised him lovingly, brought complicated emotions. Joy that he'd survived, fury at being robbed of knowing him, grief for their mother who died believing her son was dead. Dr. Morrison had died in 1982, which Margaret found both convenient and infuriating. He'd never been charged with baby trafficking, had lived out his remaining years in comfortable retirement, his reputation largely intact. The illegal prescription charges had been a minor scandal, quickly forgotten. The babies he'd sold and the women he'd traumatized were erased from official history. Margaret wrote the article carefully, threading a difficult needle. She documented what her grandmother had done without condemning or celebrating it. Let the facts speak for themselves. Let readers draw their own conclusions about whether Grace Chen had been a hero or a criminal, whether stealing babies from a trafficker was justice or just a different kind of kidnapping. The article was published in a major magazine and generated the predictable controversy. Some readers praised Grace as a whistleblower who'd saved children from being sold. others condemned her for lying to grieving mothers and taking justice into her own hands. A few suggested prosecuting the surviving family members who knowingly participated in receiving stolen babies, though statute of limitations made that legally complicated. Margaret received hundreds of emails, some from people who shared similar stories of adoption fraud and stolen children, some from adoptees who wondered if they might be among Grace's 23 stolen babies, some from mothers who'd lost children in the 70s and had always wondered if their babies had really died or if something more sinister had occurred. She answered what she could, connected people with resources, and referred several cases to law enforcement agencies that investigated historical adoption fraud. It wasn't closure. Nothing about this story would ever provide clean closure, but it was witness. Documentation. The thing her grandmother had asked for in that clear moment before Alzheimer's took her memories permanently. And sometimes, late at night, Margaret would take out the photographs and look at the faces of those 23 babies. She'd wonder who they became, where they ended up, if they were happy, if they'd figured out the truth of their origins, or if they still believed the stories they'd been told. She'd think about the mothers who'd grieved children who weren't dead, about Grace Chen, her grandmother, who'd carried that grief secondhand for 50 years, about Dr. Morrison, who'd monetized vulnerable women's desperation, about systems that created conditions where such things could happen, about individual choices made in impossible situations. The photographs never offered answers, just looked back at her with infant eyes that couldn't judge, couldn't understand, couldn't do anything except exist as evidence. Evidence that wrong can be built from salvaging other wrongs, that justice and crime sometimes wear identical faces, that bearing witness to complicated truths is harder than writing stories where heroes and villains are clearly marked. Margaret kept writing, kept investigating, kept finding stories of people whose lives had been shaped by decisions made for them before they could speak, before they could consent, before they could understand what was being taken or given or stolen in their name. And she thought about her grandmother's question, asked in that moment of clarity before memory failed, whether her choices had been right or wrong. Margaret still didn't know. Thought maybe there wasn't a single answer. Thought maybe right and wrong were less useful categories than necessary and costly and irreversible and born. Grace Chen had borne the cost of what she'd done, had carried those mothers' faces and those babies' weight for half a century, had asked only that someone remember, that the story persist beyond her failing memory. Margaret was remembering, was preserving, was making sure that 23 babies stolen in San Francisco in the 1970s weren't forgotten, even if they were never fully understood. It wasn't redemption, wasn't forgiveness, wasn't any of the things people wanted from stories about impossible choices. It was just witness, which was, Grace had promised, worth something, though what it was worth, and to whom remained questions Margaret carried now, as her grandmother once carried photographs and guilt, and the stubborn certainty that she'd made the only choices available to her. Right or wrong seemed less important than remembered, then documented, then passed forward to someone else who could bear the weight when the original bearer could no longer carry it. That, at least, Margaret could do, was doing, would continue doing, for her grandmother, for the mothers, for the 23 babies who'd grown into adults carrying origins they never chose, for everyone whose story gets lost because it's too complicated to fit into neat moral categories. She would remember, would bear witness, would tell the truth even when the truth refused to be simple. It was the least she could do, maybe the most as well. And that brings us to the end of another evening here at the Stillness Broadcast. If you've stayed with me through all of tonight's stories, I want to thank you. Truly, sincerely. It means the world to me that you've spent these hours in the dark spaces between sleep and waking, letting these tales settle into your thoughts. There's something profound about the community we build together in these moments, scattered across time zones, but connected by our fascination with the unsettling, the unexplained, the truths that hide in shadows. I genuinely hope tonight's stories gave you what you came looking for. That particular feeling that lingers after a good scare, that makes you check the locks one more time before bed. Before you drift off to sleep, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Stillness Broadcast if you haven't already. And I'd love to know. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I'll be back tomorrow night with more tales from the places we don't usually look. The corners where reality gets strange and the familiar becomes foreign. Until then, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember that the best stories are the ones that refuse to let you go. Sweet dreams, friend. I'll see you in the darkness tomorrow.